It's 8:40. Let's go through the papers this morning with the editor of Spike, Tom Slater, and PR guru, Lara Fawcett.
Right, Tom. We all know there's a terrible, terrible knife problem in Britain and in certain cities in particular, and various mayors sort of say they're going to try and get to grips with it. What has Britain's policing minister been saying?
So this comes on the back of the announcement from the Home Secretary earlier this week about the ban on zombie knives and machetes, which is coming through. So it's kind of in response to this, Chris Philp, the policing minister, was in the House of Commons, and he made the point that this isn't going to change things overnight. And obviously, given the scale of the problem, I think that should be obvious to anyone. There's been a 19% rise in knife point robberies, responsible for a large amount of the homicides that we've been seeing, particularly in places like London, particularly when you're talking about teenagers killing each other over absolutely nothing. This is the kind of weaponry that they're using. But also, I think one of the reasons it's not going to change things overnight is that sometimes we can have a slightly superficial conversation about this, because we've clamped down on one form of knife. I mean, obviously, it would seem outrageous to most people. Why would you need to own a knife of this size for any other reason? But at the same time, it's not the availability of a zombie knife or machete.
No, I mean, you can do it with a bread knife, couldn't you? I mean, that's the trouble. This
is exactly it. And the other thing is, you know, if you've got young people who are willing to illegally carry weapons in any stretch of the imagination, it's not as if they're going to be deterred from buying them on the black market or from other means and so on. I do think we often have a really shallow discussion about this. It's either we'll just ban the type of knife and then it will sort itself out, or you get into a discussion about the closure of youth centres as if someone was able to play table tennis the night before they fatally killed someone, they wouldn't have done it. I mean, it's the sort of thing where this is a much deeper sort of social problem. It involves poverty, it involves family structure, all these different things. But it does feel like we just have this very knee-jerk ban that it will go away.
But it's like, but that's because it's such a fundamental underlying issue within certain socio-economic groups. But how do you even begin to tackle it? I was saying this yesterday. I wouldn't know where to start. I think and it will take a generation.
No, definitely, and it's worth saying that these things aren't easy, regardless of where you begin with this. But I think there's just been a kind of nervousness about talking about where this issue is going, where it's coming from. There's a kind of sense that it's slightly judgy to point out that in, say, single-parent households, which are also struggling financially, therefore you've got parents who are not only on their own but at work all the time, therefore no one's looking out for them. All of these things are kind of commonsensical, and it's not judgmental to point these things out, but there's this nervousness about talking about it.
But there's a lot of nervousness about talking about sensitive issues, which are becoming real society problems, aren't there? Haven't we got to have the courage to start talking about it without the fear of being called prejudiced or judgmental, as you say?
And I think we should turn this discussion on its head, because of the fact that, say, in London, not in places like Glasgow, which has had a big knife crime problem historically, but in places like London, it tends to be Afro-Caribbean kids, broadly speaking, not exclusively. There's a nervousness about talking about that, but also the primary victims of knife crime also happen to be Afro-Caribbean kids. So it does amount to a certain level of almost racist negligence if you refuse to talk about this issue because it makes you a bit nervous, or you're worried about about going there in terms of this discussion. But it's a real issue. We shouldn't get too alarmist about it, but any number of... When you're getting into a situation where stories, as we saw over Christmas, of young people, as I say, killing each other over nothing, when that starts to become the background noise of city life, something's gone horribly wrong, I think.
I mean, these issues can be cleared up, can't they? And we've seen other... I mean, I think of New York, which had a terrible crime problem beyond belief at one point. And it was, in fact, I think it was Rudy Giuliani, who did it. He clamped down on it, and it changed the dynamic of the city.
Did he ban knives? What did he...
I don't know what he did. I can't remember what he did, but he absolutely did reverse the trend in crime.
You had
the angels, and things like that.
You had the angels on the tube. On the method, whatever they call it under the... Do they call it in America?
I forget what the phrase was, but there was certainly this move towards much more proactive policing, because people act as if policing has no difference whatsoever. It's all root causes, it's all downstream. The fact of the matter is, when you've got people taking, say, knives or guns off the street, that is obviously a net positive. There's obviously always going to be questions about how do you do that, how do you make sure you're not infringing on people's rights. All of that is obviously really important, but there's obviously a role to play in terms of trying to take these dangerous weapons out of the circulation, definitely.
All right, let's move on to the Times, Lara, where the pen is mightier than the keyboard.
Oh, so sad, isn't it? I mean, you fall into two... I mean, I still write everything in a notebook. I still have a diary that I write in. I think handwriting is such an indication of people's personality, of what... I don't know, it's such a special thing, and a handwritten thank you letter...
It does mean more.
It does mean more. One of your presenters, Christine Hamilton, have you ever seen her writing? Amazing, the most beautiful, loopy writing. And I always remember it. It's.
I used to have nice handwriting. I hardly write a thing.
So that's exactly. That was the other thing I was going to say.
type
You stop using something, and you lose it. I sometimes find my hands really shaky if I try and write a letter sometimes.
But the interesting thing in the Times is this argument now, which is actually what I find. I could have told you this. That if you're making notes or whatever else, it goes into your brain more if you write it down.
Yeah. Very true.
When one of my children had some sort of learning problems at school, they brought in an expert. Sorry?
Only one.
Yeah, only one of them. Yeah, no, they all did sort of from time to time. But they brought in this handwriting expert to look at his handwriting, and they could tell a lot from the handwriting. They said if you improve the handwriting, you improve the child's performance, and it worked.
That is really interesting. What fascinates me is how does it work with your finger when you get sent something to sign and you have to sign it with your finger? Isn't it fascinating that it still looks like you're writing? I don't know why I find that fascinating, but I do.
Oh, you see, now I would have argued the opposite.
Me too. Mine
it's
just looks
obvious.
like a
Mine just looks
scroll.
like a weird scrawl.
Well, maybe that's because my writing's a weird scrawl
it's a weird
anyway.
scrawl, yeah. That's fine.
And why is doctors' handwriting always so appalling too?
Yeah, is it just they're just trying to get through it as quickly as possible?
Probably,
I don't know, but
the art of handwriting, we shouldn't let it go.
certainly
really.
been lost.
Right, Nicola Sturgeon's in trouble with her WhatsApp messages.
Yes, so this is coming out of the Scottish COVID inquiry. So people might have remembered last week there was a big controversy over the fact that Nicola Sturgeon and various other leading SNP people had deleted their WhatsApps. We might now be finding out why that is the case. One of her aides has kept her end of the WhatsApp
wonderful.
messages. And there's a lot of effing and jeffing in it. No one will be surprised to find out that some of it was aimed towards Boris Johnson, who was branded an effing clown by Nicola Sturgeon when she was watching his press conferences. There's no Tory minister who seemingly didn't come in for some harsh criticism, shall we say, from Nicola Sturgeon. This is obviously the sort of superficial, silly, entertaining end of what's coming out of the COVID inquiry. It's obviously incredibly serious. One thing I do find interesting, though, is the fact that you see in these messages this kind of sense of moral superiority from Nicola Sturgeon. Oh, these comms are terrible, they're ruining things. And that was all the narrative throughout the pandemic. Scotland, they're so much more on the front foot. You've got England lagging behind.
We thought that, though, didn't we? I mean,
yet,
it came across that way.
And yet, in the sort of final analysis, if you look at how England and Scotland fared, not a huge amount of different. If anything, in many respects, Scotland doing worse. Yeah. So I think it's interesting looking back on that time where not only Nicola Sturgeon felt so superior in relation to Westminster, but also that was certainly the narrative in a lot of the media discussion. It doesn't look quite so enlightened now, I dare say. But
no. It's going to be an interesting one, this, but it does seem, it's Nicola Sturgeon and, frankly, the SNP just seems to be unravelling.
Yeah.
They certainly do.
So
very
suddenly
quickly
as well.
Too. Lara, tell us about measles.
Oh, crikey. OK, it's the headlines, isn't it? I mean, you do... I hate to say I'm not an anti-vaxxer. I'm a vaccine sceptic.
Right.
There's a difference. There's a difference. I do believe you hear about the negative headlines. The moment there's a death from measles, you hear about it, but you're not going to hear about all the people who've naturally survived it, like a lot of us did in the past. I remember my grandmother having measles. I thought she was really old at the time. She was probably younger than me. But I remember she was lying in a darkened room and she was ill. She was ill for a week, but she survived. But maybe everyone's immune systems were stronger then.
Or just different. I mean, I had scarlet fever as a child and I had a nasty rash, but I felt absolutely fine.
Whereas other
people are really ill with it.
Yes.
I think you do your research. I think on all these things you do your own research. There's books, like what is it, Turtles All the Way Up book or whatever. There's always books you can read and do your own research. But I do still think it's free choice. I wouldn't be pushing.
Over-vaccinated then?
Oh yeah, yes.
Do you really?
I do. I'm afraid. Read the Turtle book, Turtles All the Way Down. It's a good read.
I have everything going.
No,
Me too.
I think it's fantastic. I must say, I think the drop off in the MMR vaccinations is really concerning. Not least because that was the big, not just vaccine sceptical, but anti-vax sort of campaign. And it's worth remembering as well because these days when people talk about kind of anti-vax sentiment, they think, it's people getting online and reading things on dodgy Facebook pages or watching YouTube channels or whatever. That campaign against MMR was in the newspapers, it was in The Lancet.
It was a doctor saying it. And it's been completely discredited. He was wrong to say it, and his his research was wrong, and there's nothing wrong with the MMR vaccine. And it's not just about your child, it's about the children around as well.
100%.
And in the case of rubella, it's about anyone you might infect who's pregnant and things like that. The thing that upsets me is that now they're saying there are more and more cases of measles. Doctors were saying this years ago, we knew the take-up was getting poorer and poorer, and we should have done some sort of a campaign 5, 7, maybe even 10 years ago to prevent the outbreak of measles that's happening now.
And there's also another element, some of the sensitivities we're talking about, because it does tend to be amongst certain demographics where that you have a higher rate of kind of vaccine scepticism. Sometimes it's also just the fact that there's a language barrier in terms of getting through to them. So there's things that can be done, but often, again, there's a sort of nervousness about, or a sense of inability about how to cut through to certain communities and to make the argument and to reassure people who might be otherwise sceptical of the medical authorities in a way that other people might not be. So but it certainly needs to be tackled because, as you say, it's a whole population issue if there's a sizable minority who, for whatever reason, are.
Tell us about single-use vapes.
Yes, so the government its consultation is taking place on the question of, partly this is to do with how they're going to implement this ban on cigarette smoking, which is pretty extreme, I dare say. But also this story in particular in Telegraph is about the single-use vapes ban, which I also do wonder if it's as clear-cut as they're making out, because the concern here is that children are vaping, which is true. You know, you talk to any parents of kids in school, there's a lot of talk about people constantly vaping, these single-use ones where you can just buy them in the shop for a few pounds and so on. It seems to be what's driving it. But there's a couple of things to say on that, one of which is it's still not legal for them to purchase these things. So if there's a problem with shops selling them to young people legally, then you should come down hard on that. I don't see why making it impossible for anyone to buy them is a particularly good idea. The other thing that is worth saying is, in terms of youth vaping, it is a problem. You don't want 14, 13-year-olds, even older, getting hooked on nicotine unnecessarily. But in the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively nice problem to have. Smoking amongst that age group has fallen off a cliff, and there's not really any evidence to suggest they're going from vaping to smoking in anywhere near like the sort of numbers that we're sort of concerned about. So I do worry that there's, particularly with this desire to clamp down on vaping, it just doesn't make a lot of sense, because in general, vaping's been great for health, because it's 95% safer at a conservative estimate.
I guess the problem with it is we don't know what the long-term effects of vaping are.
Of course we don't. And the banning single-use, I mean, I get it, because they litter the streets. So that's a different argument to vaping, isn't it?
But then all sorts of things litter the
permanent
streets,
ones. But with all these things, also, it's the leaky bucket thing. It's like going back to basics. Why do people have knives in the first place? Why do people need something in their hand, like a cigarette or a vape? You know, why do people need that? I mean, if one could go back and get to the sort of root of the problem. I mean, I carry my rosaries wherever I go. That's my... And I love that. That makes me feel secure. What else can people have that will give them the comfort blanket?
If it means that in that particular age group, smoking has fallen off the edge of a cliff, as you say, what about eating sweets and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Is that... Because if you're busy doing something vaping, maybe you're not eating sweets like we used to do as kids.
But you don't need to put anything in your mouth all the time anyway. I mean, sweets is bad. Vape. I mean, you don't need to be having this oral stimulation
or something, don't they? So there you go. Has it caused less sweet eating?
Which
maybe.
Have we got time to learn about the cat?
No, we haven't.
Or teeth, even, on sweet eating.
No, we haven't got to. We've run out of time, you two.
Yeah.
But it's been good to see you both. Lara, thank you. Tom, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
We're back with all your top stories very shortly. But of course, you want to know what the weather's doing where you are today. So let's get all the details for you with Aidan McGivern.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors.